The galaxy, in the final year of the Horus heresy, groaned under the weight of unimaginable loss. 10,000 worlds burned in the fires of civil war. Brother fought brother across the stars, while the very foundations of the imperium cracked beneath the strain. Yet in the deepest sanctum beneath the imperial palace on Terra, the emperor of mankind sat in silence more profound than the void between stars. The chamber held no light, save the faint golden radiance that emanated from his form. Ancient machinery hummed in the darkness, monitoring the pulse of a dying galaxy through psychic resonance. Each death cry of his servants reached him across impossible distances. Each world lost to chaos carved another wound in his immortal consciousness. The weight of 10,000 years pressed upon shoulders that had borne the hopes of humanity since before recorded history. Horus approached. The Emperor felt his most beloved son drawing near with a fleet vast enough to darken stars. The War Master's corruption blazed like a cancer in the warp, fed by powers older than civilization. Soon the final battle would come to Terra itself. Soon the dream of human unity would face its ultimate test. But imagine for a moment if the approaching war was not the true threat. Imagine if the greatest mind in human history had missed something. Something that made the choice between father and son seem trivial by comparison. The Emperor's eyes snapped open. Golden radiance flared in the sanctum as psychic senses detected an intrusion. Not an enemy. Something else. Something desperate. The air shimmered with psychic energy. Space folded upon itself as reality bent to accommodate a presence that should not exist. A figure materialized in the chamber's center, translucent and flickering like a flame, guttering in cosmic wind. Tall and elegant, wrapped in the flowing robes of the Eldar, but bearing wounds that leaked not blood, but pure psychic energy into the warp. Eldred Ulthran, greatest of the Elder Farseers, stood dying before the master of mankind. Emperor. The alien's voice carried across dimensions, each word carved from desperation and fading strength. I bring warning, not of your son's betrayal, not of the siege to come, of something far worse. The Emperor rose from his contemplation. Power radiated from his form like heat from a forge. Speak, Ancient One. Your kind has little reason to aid mine. Eldrad's astral form flickered. Somewhere across the galaxy, his physical body fought its final battle against the servants of She Who Thirsts. Because if I do not, there will be nothing left to save. Not your imperium, not my dying race. Nothing. The Farseer raised a translucent hand. Psychic energy coalesced between his fingers, forming images of terrible clarity. The Chaos Gods play a deeper game than you know. The heresy is not their end goal. It is merely the opening move. Visions blazed in the sanctum's darkness. The Emperor saw the approaching Traitor fleet, positioning itself in patterns too precise for mere military strategy. He saw rituals carved into the hulls of 10,000 ships, each one a component in a design vast beyond mortal comprehension. He saw the positions where loyal and traitor forces would clash, marked out across the galaxy in geometric perfection. Every battle of this war has been precisely placed, Eldrad whispered. Every world that burns, every Primarch that falls, feeds energy into their grand working. They do not seek merely to corrupt your imperium. They seek to merge the warp with reality itself. The vision expanded. The Emperor witnessed a galaxy transformed. Physics became mere suggestion. Demons walked freely among mortals. The barrier between thought and matter dissolved. Chaos eternal, reality drowned in an ocean of pure warp energy, where every mortal soul became sustenance for hungry gods. The ritual nears completion. Eldrad continued. When Horus arrives, when the final battles begin, the deaths of your Primarchs will provide the final component. Their psychic resonance, amplified by the grief and rage of their followers, will tear the veil permanently. Not in one location, but everywhere at once. Horror crept into the Emperor's perfect features. He had foreseen many futures, witnessed countless potential timelines, but this possibility had been hidden from him, shielded by the combined will of all four Chaos gods working in unprecedented unity. How long? His voice carried the weight of mountains. The siege begins in 3 months. The ritual completes when the first Primarch dies in battle over Terra. After that, there is no stopping it. The Emperor's mind raced through possibilities. His loyal sons were scattered across the galaxy, racing to Terra's defense. Sanguinius, Dawn, the Khan, Russ, the Lion. 5 of his greatest champions. Against them came the traitors, Horus empowered by all 4 Chaos gods, Fulgrim lost to Slanesh, Angron consumed by Khorne, Mortarion embracing Nurgle, Magnus bound to Zinch, Perturabo bitter with decades of resentment, Lorgar the architect of this corruption, Kurz driven by visions of death, Alfarius playing games within games. 2 paths crystallized in his transcendent consciousness. Save the loyal 5 by allowing the traitor 4 to live, knowing their survival would doom billions to chaos corruption across 1,000 worlds, or sacrifice his loyal sons to destroy the traitors, leaving the Imperium so weakened it would crumble within generations. Neither choice offered victory, only different forms of defeat. There must be another way, the Emperor said, though his voice carried no certainty. Eldrad's form grew fainter. Across the galaxy, his death approached with each passing moment. There is. But the price... The Farseer's image flickered like a candle in wind. The price is everything you are. Explain. The ritual draws power from the warp connection of your sons. Sever that connection, and the ritual fails. But to cut the Primarchs from the warp entirely would require power beyond measure. Power that could only come from one source. Understanding dawned in golden eyes. My own connection to the warp. More than connection. Your godhood itself. The very essence that makes you immortal. To save your sons and the galaxy, you would have to become what you once were before, Molech. Mortal. Finite. Human. The chamber fell silent, save for the whisper of ancient machinery. The Emperor contemplated a choice that would unmake everything he had become across 10,000 years of existence. To save his children, he would have to sacrifice the power that allowed him to protect them. Eldrad's astral projection began to dissolve. I die now, Emperor. The choice is yours. But know that if you do nothing, when next the sun rises over Terra, it will shine on a galaxy where reality itself has surrendered to chaos. The Farseer's form scattered like smoke on wind. His final words echoed in the sanctum long after his presence faded. Choose wisely. Last hope of both our races. Silence returned to the deepest chamber beneath the imperial palace. The Emperor stood alone in golden radiance, contemplating the weight of choice that would determine the fate of every living thing in the galaxy. The war was coming. His children approached from opposite directions, loyal sons racing to defend their father, traitor sons coming to destroy him. And between them stood a decision that would either save everything or damn it to an eternity of chaos. Yet perhaps damnation and salvation were not so different when weighed against the preservation of hope itself. The Emperor closed his eyes and began to plan for a sacrifice greater than death. Across the void between stars, the greatest armada in human history carved its way through the warp toward Terra. 10,000 ships bore the banners of the War Master, each vessel a cathedral of war consecrated to the destruction of the imperium. Yet within the flagship vengeful spirit, something far more terrible than mere rebellion took shape. Horus Lupercal stood at the center of his command sanctum, but he was no longer alone in his own flesh. 4 voices whispered in his mind, each demanding precedence, each promising victory through different paths of damnation. The competing influences of the Chaos Gods racked his superhuman frame with power that threatened to tear him apart from within. Khorne's rage blazed through his veins like molten metal, demanding that he charge straight at Terra's defenses and drown the throne world in blood. Nurgle's patient corruption whispered of slow strangulation, of sieges that would last decades, while plague and despair consumed the defenders from within. Tzeentch wove elaborate schemes in his thoughts, plans within plans that shifted with each passing moment. Slaanesh offered the exquisite pleasure of watching his father's dreams die slowly, savoring each moment of the Imperium's fall. War Master? The voice belonged to Erebus, the word-bearer who had first opened the door to chaos corruption. The fleet maintains formation. We will reach Terra's outer defenses within 3 standard months. Horus nodded, though the gesture sent waves of conflicting divine will through his consciousness. When he spoke, his words carried harmonics that had not been there before the gods claimed him. Good. Ensure the positioning remains precise. Each ship must arrive exactly where the ritual demands. The words surprised him even as he spoke them. He had not consciously planned those formations, yet somewhere in the confluence of divine wills that shared his skull, the knowledge burned bright and certain. The Chaos Gods required more than simple victory. They needed the deaths to occur in specific patterns, at predetermined locations, channeling psychic energy along ley lines that had been carved into reality itself across 7 years of civil war. Far below the command deck, in the vengeful spirit's bowels, the other traitor Primarchs felt the same inexplicable compulsion drawing them forward. Each fought the sensation in their own way, not understanding that resistance was futile against powers that had orchestrated this moment across millennia. Fulgrim writhed in his quarters aboard the Pride of the Emperor, his perfect features contorting with pleasure and pain as Slaanesh's influence grew stronger with each passing day. The demon that shared his body whispered sweet poison in his thoughts, promising that the coming battle would surpass every sensation he had ever experienced. Angron paced his command deck like a caged beast, the butcher's nails driving spikes of agony through his skull with each heartbeat. Yet beneath the pain, beneath the rage that Khorne fed into his mind like fuel onto fire, something else stirred. A growing certainty that this battle would be different, that the blood spilled on Terra would feed hungers older than worlds. Mortarion stood silent in his poisoned gardens, watching the decay that Nurgle had blessed him with spread through the very bulkheads of his flagship. The Deathguard Primarch understood patience better than any of his brothers. He could sense the slow poison of fate working its way toward Terra, toward a conclusion that would transform not just the Imperium, but reality itself. Magnus the Red remained locked in his tower aboard his crystal ship, wrestling with visions that Tzeentch showed him like fragments of a shattered mirror. The Crimson King saw 1,000 possible futures, each one ending in fire and transformation. Yet in rare moments of clarity, between the gods' manipulations, he glimpsed something else, a pattern in the approaching convergence that filled him with dread. On Terra, the loyal Primarchs felt the approaching storm in their own ways. Sanguinius stood alone on the highest spire of the imperial palace, his pristine white wings spread against the dying light of Terra's sun. The Blood Angel's Primarch possessed the gift of foresight, a blessing and curse inherited from his father's own psychic might. But the visions that plagued him now surpassed anything he had experienced in 2 centuries of existence. He saw himself dying on Terra's soil, his blood spreading across golden marble while reality cracked around his failing heart. He saw dawn falling beneath Perturabo's hammer, the master of fortifications crushed by the master of siegecraft. He saw the Khan cut down by traitor blades, the White Scar's Primarch's speed finally insufficient to carry him from death's embrace. He saw Russ and the Lion arriving too late, their combined might turned to ash by forces beyond mortal comprehension. But worst of all, he saw what happened after their deaths. Reality itself began to unravel as massive psychic energies tore holes in the fabric of space and time. Demons poured through rifts that spread like infections across the galaxy. The boundary between the warp and material universe dissolved, leaving existence itself at the mercy of hungering gods. "Father," Sanguinius whispered to the wind, "what choice will you make when the moment comes?" Below him, deeper in the palace, Rogel Dawn supervised the construction of defenses that he knew in his heart would not be sufficient. The Imperial Fist's Primarch had fortified 1,000 worlds in his lifetime. He understood the mathematics of war better than any living being, save perhaps Perturabo himself. Yet something about the approaching battle troubled him beyond mere tactical considerations. The timing was wrong. Horus approached with a vast fleet, but not at the moment of the Imperium's greatest weakness. Other loyal legions still fought across the galaxy. Supply lines remained partially intact. A more cunning commander would have waited, allowed the Imperium to weaken further before striking the killing blow, unless tactical victory was not the true objective. Dawn's scarred hands traced patterns across holographic displays showing Terra's defenses. Each bunker, each wall, each gun emplacement had been positioned with mathematical precision. Yet he found himself wondering if precision itself might be the trap. If the enemy required specific locations for their final assault, then perhaps the very act of defending those positions played into their hands. The Imperial Fist's Primarch reached for his personal vox, intending to contact his father directly. The questions burning in his mind demanded answers, and there was little time before the storm broke upon them. In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, the Emperor stood before Malcador the Sigillite, in a chamber shielded from all forms of observation. The ancient Psyker, who had served as his closest advisor for millennia, regarded his master with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. "The Farseer spoke truly," the Emperor said without preamble. "I have seen the patterns he described. The Chaos Gods play a game far deeper than mere corruption." Malcador nodded slowly. Despite his advanced age, his mind remained sharp as a blade. "I felt the disturbance when he manifested. His warning carried the taste of absolute truth. What will you do?" "I am considering options that may damn us all," the Emperor replied. "To save the galaxy, I may have to abandon everything that makes salvation possible." The third path he mentioned. The Emperor turned away, golden radiance dimming as his thoughts turned inward. "To break the ritual, I must sever my son's connection to the warp entirely. All of them, loyal and traitor alike. But such an action would require me to sacrifice the very power that allows me to protect them." Malcador absorbed this information with the calm that came from facing impossible choices throughout history. "You would become mortal. More than mortal, I would become what I was before I walked into the portal on Moloch, before I stole power from the Chaos Gods themselves. Human, finite, capable of death." Silence fell between them. Outside the shielded chamber, the preparations for war continued. Soldiers drilled, weapons were blessed, fortifications rose from Terra's bedrock like the bones of giants. Yet in this small room, the true battle had already begun. The battle for the soul of the Emperor of mankind. "There may be another way," Malcador said eventually. "If the ritual requires Primarch deaths in specific patterns, perhaps we can disrupt those patterns without the ultimate sacrifice." "I have considered this," the Emperor replied. "But the Chaos Gods have planned for millennia. Every contingency, every possible disruption has been accounted for. They will adapt their ritual to whatever resistance we offer. Only a complete severance of warp connection can stop them permanently." The Emperor's voice carried a weight that pressed against the very air in the chamber. "I created my sons to be more than human, to carry burdens that mortal men couldn't bear. Now I may have to unmake that gift to save them from it." Above them, across the palace and throughout the solar system, loyal forces continued their desperate preparations. They did not know that their father contemplated a sacrifice that would fundamentally change the nature of their war. They did not know that victory and defeat balanced on the edge of choices that transcended mere military strategy. They knew only that the storm was coming, and that when it broke, everything they had fought for would hang in the balance. The War Master's fleet drew closer with each passing hour, carrying with it the seeds of either salvation or ultimate damnation. And in the depths of the imperial palace, the master of mankind weighed the price of godhood against the survival of hope itself. The galaxy held its breath, waiting for the choice that would determine the fate of all things. The Emperor descended deeper into the imperial palace than any living being save himself had ever traveled. Past the throne room where he would soon face his final trial. Past the laboratories where the Primarchs had been forged in genetic fire. Down through layers of rockrete and adamantine, through vaults that held the accumulated knowledge of millennia, until he reached the sealed entrance to his greatest failure. The webway gate stood broken and scarred, its elegant Eldar architecture twisted by the demonic incursion that had shattered his dream of human evolution. Custodians maintained eternal vigil here, guarding against the horrors that still writhed beyond the damaged portal. Yet for all their vigilance, they could not see what the Emperor saw as he approached the ruined gateway. Threads of psychic energy still connected this fragment to the greater webway network. Damaged, yes. Corrupted by chaos, certainly, but not entirely severed. And through those tenuous connections, he could reach minds that might hold the answers he desperately needed. The Emperor placed his hands upon the gate's broken frame. Golden light blazed from his touch, forcing the warp energies back into temporary submission. His consciousness flowed through the cracks in reality, following paths that the Eldar had walked for millions of years, seeking those who still remembered the ancient ways. He found them in the dying craft worlds, the last bastions of a race that had learned too late the price of excess. Farseers and warlocks who had watched their species dwindle to mere thousands, their prescient gifts turned toward preventing final extinction rather than achieving glory. They sensed his approach with mixtures of fear and desperate hope. "Monkey Emperor," came the psychic whisper of Farseer Kairis of Alatok. "Why do you seek the wisdom of the dying?" "Because the dying understand prices that the living cannot pay," the Emperor replied across dimensional barriers. Eldrad spoke of a third path. I would know its cost. Images flowed through the webway's damaged pathways. The Emperor saw fragments of ancient knowledge, memories preserved from the height of the Elder Empire, when gods walked among mortals, and reality bent to the will of those who understood its deepest secrets. He saw the moment when the Elder's excess birthed Slanesh, tearing a hole in space and time that consumed their home worlds and cast their survivors into eternal exile. But among those memories, he found what he sought. Knowledge of how divine essence could be severed from mortal form, how godhood itself could be sacrificed to achieve goals that mere power could never accomplish. The Eldar had faced such choices when their gods died fighting Slaanesh. They had learned the mathematics of divine sacrifice through bitter necessity. "The path exists," whispered another voice, Farseer Thirianna of Ayanden. "But understand, Emperor of the Mon-Kik, what you contemplate has never been attempted by one of your power. The backlash could shatter more than your own essence. It could break the barriers between dimensions entirely." "Speak plainly," the Emperor commanded. "To sever the warp connection of your sons, you must channel your own divine nature through them and then tear it free. The psychic shock will make you mortal. Yes, but the released energy must go somewhere. It could manifest as a psychic storm that would dwarf even the birth of Slaanesh." The connection began to fade as the damaged webway struggled to maintain coherence across such vast distances. But the Emperor had learned what he needed. The third path existed. It was possible, and it might well damn the galaxy even as it saved it. He withdrew his consciousness from the webway and returned to his physical form in the chamber beneath the palace. Yet as he stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of his greatest ambition, memories unbidden rose from the depths of his immortal mind. Moloch, the world where everything had changed. He remembered walking across alien landscapes toward a portal that should not exist. The gateway had been carved from reality itself by intelligences older than human civilization, a doorway leading to the realm of the Chaos gods themselves. He had known the danger, had understood that to steal power from beings that predated existence itself would carry a price beyond mortal comprehension. Yet he had stepped through anyway. The realm beyond had been impossible to describe in words that mortal minds could grasp. Here, thought became reality, and reality became thought. The four great powers of chaos had awaited him, not as enemies, but as potential partners in a bargain that would reshape the galaxy. "We offer you power, young god," Khorne had rumbled, his voice the sound of civilizations dying. "Power to unite your species under your will." "We offer you knowledge," Tzeentch had whispered, its form shifting through configurations that hurt to perceive. "Knowledge to reshape reality according to your vision." "We offer you endurance," Nurgle had laughed, its corpulent form seething with creative decay. "Endurance to outlast the death of stars." "We offer you perfection," Slaanesh had sung, its beauty terrible beyond description. "Perfection that will make you beloved by all who serve you." And he had accepted. Not out of ambition, but out of necessity. The galaxy had been dying, consumed by old night and the predations of alien empires. Humanity needed a protector, a god-emperor who could forge unity from chaos and guide his species to its ultimate destiny among the stars. The power he had stolen from the Chaos gods had allowed him to create the Primarchs, to forge the Space Marine legions, to begin the Great Crusade that brought 10,000 worlds under human rule. Yet the price of that bargain had been woven into the very fabric of his divine essence. Now, standing in the ruins of the webway, the Emperor understood how that price could become salvation instead of damnation. The power he had taken from chaos could be returned to them in a way that would break their grand ritual forever. But returning that power meant returning the godhood it had purchased. He would become mortal. He would age and die like any human. But his sons would be free from the warp's influence, and the galaxy would endure. Above him, the first sounds of distant battle echoed through the palace's foundations. Terra's outer defenses had detected enemy scouts probing the system's edge. The storm Horus brought with him had finally reached the cradle of humanity. Rogel Dawn stood in the primary command center, studying tactical displays that showed the enemy's approach vectors. The Imperial Fist's Primarch, frowned as he analyzed the positioning of traitor vessels. They were not adopting optimal attack formations. Instead, they seemed to be arranging themselves in geometric patterns that served no apparent military purpose. "Lord Dawn," reported Captain Sigismund, first captain of the Imperial Fists. "The enemy advance forces are maintaining position at the edge of the system. They're not pressing their reconnaissance advantage." Dawn nodded slowly, his scarred features troubled. "They're waiting for something, or positioning for something that has nothing to do with conventional warfare." The realization struck him like a bolt of thunder. The enemy was not positioning for battle. They were positioning for a ritual. Each ship was a component in a vast pattern designed to channel energies that had nothing to do with void warfare and everything to do with powers beyond mortal comprehension. "Signal all defensive commands," Dawn ordered. "Alter our positioning immediately. Move fleet elements to break up their formation patterns, even if it weakens our tactical advantage." "Lord Primarch," Sigismund protested. "That would leave gaps in our defenses that is an order, Captain." As Sigismund moved to relay the commands, Dawn turned his attention to internal communications. His father needed to know what the enemy was truly planning. But as he reached for the secure Vox channel, another presence entered the command center. Sanguinius strode through the armored doors, his perfect features marked by lines of strain that had not been there days earlier. The Blood Angels. Primarch's prescient visions had grown stronger as the enemy approached, and the weight of foreseen doom pressed upon his shoulders like a mountain of lead. "Brother," Sanguinius said without preamble, "we need to speak with Father. Both of us. Now." Dawn studied his brother's face and saw there reflections of his own growing certainty. "You've seen it too. The pattern? I've seen what happens if the pattern completes." Sanguinius's voice carried harmonics of anguish that struck Dawn like physical blows. "I've seen reality itself come apart at the seams. We are not fighting for the Imperium, Rogel. We are fighting for the continued existence of existence itself." Together, the two Primarchs made their way through the palace depths toward their father's private chambers. They found the Emperor standing before the sealed webway gate, golden radiance dim with exhaustion from his communion with alien minds. "Father," Sanguinius said, his voice carrying both respect and desperate urgency, "I demand to know what choice you face. My visions show you standing at a crossroads, but the paths beyond are shrouded from me. What are you not telling us?" The Emperor turned to face his sons. For a moment, they saw him not as the master of mankind, but as a father burdened by impossible decisions. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated sorrow. "I face a choice between saving some of you and destroying others, or finding a third path that may cost me everything I am." Dawn stepped forward. "Explain." "The Chaos Gods have orchestrated this entire war as a ritual sacrifice. Every battle, every death, has fed energy into a working design to merge the warp with reality permanently. When you fight your traitor brothers, when any of you die, the psychic resonance will complete their grand summoning." Understanding dawned in both Primarchs' eyes. Sanguinius spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "You could save the loyal among us by allowing the traitors to live, or destroy the traitors by sacrificing we who remain loyal. Neither choice offers victory," the Emperor confirmed. "Both lead to different forms of defeat, but there is a third option. I can sever all Primarchs from the warp entirely, making the ritual impossible to complete." "At what cost?" Dawn asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew. "My godhood, my immortality, the very power that allows me to protect humanity." Silence fell in the chamber like a shroud. The three greatest figures in the Imperium stood together in the ruins of their greatest hope, contemplating a sacrifice that would save the galaxy by abandoning it. Yet perhaps abandonment was not the same as defeat. Perhaps there were victories that could only be achieved through letting go of the power to achieve them. The Emperor looked upon his sons and saw in their faces reflections of his own resolve. They would not ask him to choose their lives over countless billions. They would not demand that he preserve his power at the cost of existence itself. They were worthy of the sacrifice he contemplated, and that knowledge, more than any other consideration, convinced him that the third path was not just possible, but necessary. The galaxy would endure, even if its God-Emperor did not. The Traitor fleet carved its way through the warp toward Terra like a dagger aimed at the heart of the Imperium. Yet within that vast armada, cracks began to show as the competing wills of the Chaos Gods pressed their champions toward purposes that had little to do with military victory. Magnus the Red stood in the crystal tower that served as his sanctum aboard the flagship of the Thousand Suns. Around him, the walls pulsed with impossible geometries that hurt mortal minds to perceive. Tzeentch's influence had grown stronger with each passing day, flooding his consciousness with visions and schemes that shifted like smoke on wind. Yet in rare moments between the gods' manipulations, fragments of his original intellect surfaced like islands in a storm-tossed sea. One such moment came as he studied the tactical displays showing their fleet's approach vectors. The formations were precise, yes, but not for any purpose that made strategic sense. Each ship occupied a position in space that corresponded not to optimal firing solutions or defensive coverage, but to points on a vast geometric pattern that extended beyond the solar system itself. "What are you doing to us?" Magnus whispered to the demon that shared his skull. "This is not conquest. This is ritual." Laughter echoed in his mind, the sound of libraries burning and scholars driven mad by forbidden knowledge. "Clever, my Crimson King. But cleverness will not free you from our bargain. You are precisely where you need to be, doing exactly what you must do." The clarity faded like morning mist, leaving Magnus once again adrift in visions of possible futures. But the knowledge remained, buried deep in his consciousness. His fleet was not approaching Terra to win a war. They were moving into position to complete a working that would reshape reality itself. Elsewhere in the Armada, other traitor Primarchs felt the growing weight of divine compulsion in their own ways. Mortarion stood in the Garden of Decay that had replaced his flagship's command center, watching plague blossoms bloom from the metal deck plates. Nurgle's gifts had transformed him into something that was no longer entirely alive, yet not quite dead. The Death Guard Primarch understood patience better than any of his brothers, but the strategies being imposed upon him by divine will tested even his legendary endurance. "The approach vector is inefficient," he said to the corpulent demon that whispered sweet poison in his thoughts. "We could reach Terra in half the time if we adjusted course by 12 degrees. "Efficiency is a mortal concern," came the bubbling reply. "We serve purposes beyond mere speed. Trust in the eternal cycle, my son. All things decay in their proper time." Mortarion's scarred features twisted with frustration. Since his fall to chaos, he had retained more independence than many of his brothers. The god of decay and rebirth was patient, willing to let his servants think they made their own choices, even as they followed predetermined paths. But lately, those paths had led in directions that made no tactical sense. His concerns deepened when Perturabo's harsh voice crackled over the Vox network, demanding immediate conference. The Iron Warrior's Primarch sounded even more bitter than usual, his words edged with barely controlled fury. Minutes later, Mortarion materialized in Perturabo's strategy chamber through the warp-tainted teleportarium systems that now linked their vessels. He found his brother standing over holographic displays, his power armor scarred by decades of siege warfare, his face a mask of accumulated resentment. "Look at this," Perturabo snarled, gesturing at the tactical projections. "Look at these formations, and tell me they serve any purpose beyond cosmic theater." Mortarion studied the displays with eyes that had learned to see beyond mere physical reality. The patterns were indeed strange, prioritizing geometric precision over military effectiveness. You've noticed it too. I've noticed that we're being positioned like pieces on a game board by players who care nothing for victory in any sense we understand. Perturabo's voice carried the weight of a lifetime spent watching his tactical brilliance be dismissed by those who claimed to know better. We are not conquerors approaching Terra. We are ritual components being moved into position. And yet we cannot resist, Mortarion observed. The compulsions grow stronger each day. Perturabo slammed his gauntleted fist against the holographic display, causing the images to flicker and distort. I will not be a puppet, not for the Emperor who abandoned me, and not for gods who think they can use me. Yet even as he spoke the words, both Primarchs felt the inexorable pull of divine will settling over their minds like chains forged from their own choices. They had sought power in chaos, and power had found them. But the price of that power was freedom itself. On Terra, the loyal Primarchs felt the approaching storm in ways their corrupted brothers could no longer comprehend. Jagatai Khan arrived first, his White Scars fleet emerging from the warp at the edge of the solar system, like hunting hawks descending upon prey. The Khan had always been the swiftest of the Primarchs, and when the call came to defend Terra, he had abandoned his campaigns on the galactic rim without hesitation. His ships bore the scars of running battles fought across half the galaxy, but they had arrived in time. Leman Russ came next, the Wolf King's great company materializing in a blaze of controlled warp energy that spoke of desperate haste. The Space Wolves Primarch had been hunting traitor forces in the galactic north when word reached him of the crisis brewing at humanity's birthworld. His ships reeked of blood and battle, testimony to the path of destruction he had carved through enemy forces to reach his father's side. Last came Lion L. Johnson, the Dark Angel's Primarch, emerging from the warp with the cold precision that marked everything he did. The Lion had been coordinating loyalist forces across multiple sectors, trying to prevent the complete collapse of imperial authority in the outer reaches. His arrival brought not just another legion, but strategic intelligence that painted a grim picture of the galaxy's state. The 5 loyal Primarchs gathered in the Emperor's private audience chamber, deep within the imperial palace. Sanguinius and Rogel Dawn were joined by their newly arrived brothers, creating a circle of demigods whose combined presence made the very air shimmer with barely contained power. "Father," the Khan said without preamble, his voice carrying the directness of the steps where he had been raised. "We have abandoned campaigns across the galaxy to answer your call. Tell us why Terra requires the presence of 5 Primarchs when our legions are desperately needed elsewhere." The Emperor stood before his sons, golden radiance dimmed by the weight of knowledge that pressed upon his consciousness. He could not tell them everything. Not yet. The full truth of his planned sacrifice would come later, when they were prepared to understand its necessity, but they deserved to know the scope of the threat they faced. "The war you think you are fighting is not the war being fought," he said, his words carrying harmonics that resonated in their superhuman souls. "Horus's rebellion was never about replacing me as ruler of humanity. It was about creating the conditions for a ritual that will merge the warp with reality permanently." Silence fell over the chamber. The Primarchs absorbed this information with the tactical minds that had conquered worlds in their father's name. It was Russ who spoke first, his scarred features twisted into a snarl that revealed fangs inherited from Fenris's harsh evolution. "A ritual that requires our deaths," the Wolf King growled. "That's why the formations make no sense. They're not positioning for battle. They're positioning for sacrifice." "Precisely," the Emperor confirmed. "Every clash between you and your traitor brothers feeds energy into their working. The psychic resonance of Primarch deaths, amplified by the grief and rage of your followers, provides the final component they need." Lion L. Johnson stepped forward, his pale features marked by lines of strain. Then we do not engage them. We allow them to approach terror, but we do not give them the deaths they require. It will not be that simple, Sanguinius interjected, his prescient gifts allowing him to see further than tactical considerations alone. They will find ways to force confrontation. The ritual demands completion, and the gods who orchestrate it have had millennia to account for resistance. The Emperor nodded gravely. Which is why we must consider options beyond conventional warfare. But know this, my sons. Whatever path we choose, the price will be higher than any victory we have achieved before. Before any of the Primarchs could respond to their father's ominous words, the chamber's defenses detected an impossible intrusion. Reality warped and twisted as something emerged from the webway gate that should have been sealed against all passage. Ancient barriers designed to contain the demonic breach parted like curtains before a presence that carried no taint of chaos. Vulcan stepped through the dimensional rift, his massive frame wreathed in flames that burned without heat. The Salamander's Primarch bore the marks of long travel through alien pathways, his armor scarred by encounters with things that existed only in the spaces between dimensions. In his hands, he carried a collection of crystalline artifacts that pulsed with inner light. "Father," Vulcan said, his voice carrying the deep harmonics of forge fire and creation, "I bring gifts from the dying craft worlds, Eldar soul stones, attuned to frequencies that may disrupt the Chaos God's grand working." The Emperor's eyes blazed with sudden hope as he examined the alien artifacts. Each soul stone contained the preserved essence of an Eldar who had died fighting against chaos corruption. Their accumulated psychic energy, properly channeled, might provide the foundation for a counter-ritual that could break the traitor's plans. "Where did you acquire these?" he asked, though his prescient gifts already showed him fragments of the answer. "From farseers who remembered the bargains you made in humanity's darkest hour," Vulcan replied. "They know what approaches terror. Some among them would rather see their ancient enemies survive than watch reality itself consumed by she who thirsts and her divine siblings." The Emperor held one of the soul stones to the light, watching coruscating energies play across its crystalline surface. "These may provide the key to a third option, a path between saving some of you and sacrificing others." "Speak plainly, Father," Russ demanded. "What third option?" The Emperor met each of his sons' gazes in turn. They had followed him across the galaxy, conquered worlds in his name, suffered losses and betrayals that would have broken lesser beings. They deserved honesty, even if that honesty led them into choices that transcended the merely heroic. "I am considering a sacrifice that would sever all Primarchs from the warp permanently. You would become mortal, yes, but you would be free from chaos influence forever, and their ritual would fail." Understanding dawned in their superhuman minds. They saw the implications immediately. Their father was contemplating not just victory over the traitors, but the fundamental transformation of everything they were. The chamber fell silent as the 6 most powerful beings in human space contemplated a choice that would determine the fate of existence itself. Outside, the traitor fleet drew closer, carrying with it the seeds of either ultimate triumph or absolute damnation. Yet perhaps the greatest battles were not fought with weapons of war, but with the willingness to sacrifice everything in service of something greater than victory itself. The loyal Primarchs looked upon their father and saw reflected in his golden gaze the same resolve that had driven them to conquer the galaxy in humanity's name. If he was prepared to sacrifice his godhood for their freedom, then they would stand ready to accept whatever consequences such sacrifice might bring. The war for Terra's fate had truly begun, and the first shots would be fired not with bolters or blades, but with choices that transcended the merely mortal understanding of victory and defeat. The siege of Terra began not with the thunder of orbital bombardment, but with the whisper of reality coming undone. Horus Lupercal stood upon the command deck of the Vengeful Spirit as his vast armada engaged the outer defenses of humanity's birthworld. 10,000 ships unleashed the fury of the galaxy's greatest naval force, yet their assault patterns followed geometries that had nothing to do with military victory. Each barrage struck at coordinates predetermined by calculations older than human civilization. Each advance positioned traitor vessels in formations that would have been tactically suicidal if conquest had been their true purpose. But conquest was never the objective. The War Master understood this now, as the competing voices of 4 chaos gods harmonized into a single imperative that burned through his enhanced consciousness. Terra was not a prize to be won. It was an altar to be consecrated with the blood of demigods. "Lord Horus," reported Malaghurst, his equerry's scarred features illuminated by the hellish glow of tactical displays. "The outer defense stations are responding as predicted. They're concentrating fire on our advance elements exactly where the ritual calculations indicated they would." Horus nodded, though the gesture sent waves of divine will through his superhuman frame. "Good. Maintain the pattern. Every shot they fire, every death we suffer, feeds energy into the working. Soon the veil will grow thin enough for our true purpose to begin." Around them, the bridge crew went about their duties with the mechanical precision of mortals whose souls had been touched by powers beyond their comprehension. They had served the Emperor once, fought for the dream of human unity among the stars. Now they served older dreams, hungrier gods, purposes that transcended mortal understanding of victory and defeat. On Terra's surface, the first signs of cosmic horror began to manifest. Rogel Dawn stood atop the Aegis defense line, watching Lance fire streak across Terra's sky like falling stars. Each energy blast that struck Imperial shields created brief aurora effects that hurt to observe directly. The colors were wrong, carrying spectrums that had no place in baseline reality. Worse, the patterns they formed in the sky corresponded to no natural phenomenon he had ever studied. "Lord Primarch," reported Captain Sigismund, his voice tight with barely controlled unease. "Astropathic communications are becoming increasingly difficult. The warp is active in ways our navigators have never encountered." Dawn's enhanced senses perceived what his mortal followers could not. Reality itself was beginning to strain around the battle sites. Each explosion, each death, each moment of psychic resonance between the attacking fleet and defending forces created hairline fractures in the barrier between dimensions. Through those cracks, things that should not exist pressed against the material universe with growing hunger. "Signal all defensive commands," Dawn ordered. "Restrict engagement to minimum necessary force. Do not give the enemy the large-scale battles they seek." Yet even as he spoke the words, Dawn knew they might be meaningless. The traitor forces were positioning themselves to force exactly the kind of massive confrontations that their ritual required, and when Primarch faced Primarch in combat, the psychic energies released would dwarf anything that conventional warfare could produce. In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, Malkador the Sigillite stood before banks of astropathic equipment that had been repurposed for communications far more dangerous than routine Imperial administration. The ancient Psyker's weathered features were marked by strain as he maintained contact with operatives scattered across the galaxy, each one investigating sites that had begun to resonate with the same terrible energies building around Terra. "Report, Corax," Malkador whispered into the modified Vox array. The voice that answered came from light years away, filtered through dimensions that existed only in the spaces between thoughts. Corvus Corax, Primarch of the Raven Guard, had spent months investigating anomalous sites across the galaxy at Malkador's secret direction. His findings painted a picture of cosmic manipulation that spanned the entire heresy. "Sigillite!" Corax's voice carried harmonics of exhaustion and growing horror. "I've reached the third site you identified. The ruins here are identical to those on Kolth and Prospero. Geometric patterns carved into the planet's crust, all oriented toward Terra's galactic coordinates. But worse than that, the patterns are active. They're channeling psychic energy like conductors in some vast circuit." Malcador closed his ancient eyes, feeling the weight of understanding settle upon his consciousness like lead. How many sites respond to your presence? Every world where major heresy battles were fought. Istvan Fi, where Ferrus Manus died. The Calth system, where Guilliman and Lorgar clashed. Prospero, where Magnus fell to the wolves. Dozens of others. They're all connected, Sigillite, all feeding into something centered on terror. The communication ended as warp storms made further contact impossible. But Malcador had heard enough to confirm his worst fears. The entire Horus heresy, 7 years of the galaxy's bloodiest civil war, had been orchestrated to position psychic resonance points across known space. Every major battle, every Primarch confrontation, every moment of cosmic significance had been carefully calculated to serve a purpose that transcended mere politics or military conquest. The Chaos Gods had played a game spanning decades, moving pieces across the galactic board with patience that mortal minds could barely comprehend. And Terra was the culmination of their efforts, the focal point where all that accumulated energy would be channeled into a working that would remake reality itself. Malcador made his way through the palace depths toward the Emperor's private sanctum, his ancient joints protesting each step. The knowledge he carried demanded immediate action, yet he feared that action might already be impossible. The ritual was too far advanced, its components too carefully positioned. Victory through conventional means seemed as distant as the stars themselves. He found the Emperor standing before the soul stones that Vulcan had retrieved from the Eldar craftworlds. Golden radiance played across the crystalline artifacts, testing their resonant frequencies, measuring their capacity to channel energies that existed beyond normal physics. The Master of Mankind looked up as Malcador entered, and in those ancient eyes the Sigillite saw reflections of his own despair. "You have spoken with Corax," the Emperor said without preamble. "I have. The scope of their manipulation exceeds even our worst projections. Every world where your sons have bled has been turned into a component in their grand working." The Emperor nodded gravely. "I have seen the patterns in the warp, felt the currents of psychic energy flowing from 1,000 battlefields toward this single point. We face not merely rebellion, old friend, but the systematic transformation of reality according to the will of beings that predate human civilization." "Then conventional victory is impossible," Malcador stated. "No matter how we defend Terra, no matter how we position our forces, we will be forced into the confrontations that their ritual requires." "Yes," the Emperor confirmed, "which is why I must choose the third path, regardless of its cost." Malcador studied his master's face, seeing there the weight of a decision that would fundamentally alter the nature of existence. "Tell me." "The ritual draws power from the warp connection that makes my sons more than mortal. To break that connection permanently, I must sacrifice the divine essence that allows me to maintain it. My godhood, my immortality, the very power that has protected humanity for 10,000 years." The Sigillite absorbed this information with the calm that came from facing impossible choices throughout the rise and fall of civilizations. "You would become mortal, truly mortal, more than mortal. I would return to what I was before Molech, before I stole power from the Chaos Gods themselves. Human, finite, capable of death and error and all the frailties that make mortality both tragic and precious." Above them, beyond the palace walls, the siege of Terra continued to escalate. Each explosion, each death, each moment of psychic resonance added another thread to a tapestry of cosmic horror that would soon envelop the galaxy. Yet in this small chamber, two of the most powerful beings in human history contemplated a sacrifice that would either save everything or damn it beyond redemption. "There is another consideration," Malcador said quietly. "Sanguinius has been experiencing visions of what the galaxy becomes if the ritual succeeds. Perhaps he should know what choice you face. The Emperor's golden radiance dimmed as he contemplated the wisdom of that suggestion. Summon him. It is time he understood the full scope of what approaches. Minutes later, Sanguinius entered the chamber, his perfect features marked by exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. The Blood Angel's Primarch had spent days wrestling with visions that showed reality itself transforming into something that human minds could not comprehend. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics of anguish that made the air itself seem to weep. "Father," Sanguinius said, his prescient gifts already showing him fragments of the conversation to come, "I have seen what happens if the ritual completes. Not just the death of the Imperium, but the death of physics itself. The galaxy becomes a realm where thought and matter merge, where demons walk among mortals as easily as breathing air, where every human soul becomes fodder for entities that hunger for experiences beyond mortal comprehension." "You have seen truly," the Emperor confirmed. "Show Malcador what you have witnessed." Sanguinius closed his eyes and allowed his prescient visions to flow outward through psychic channels that connected all three of them. Malcador gasped as images flooded his ancient consciousness. He saw Terra transformed into a demon world where the imperial palace writhed with living architecture that fed on the suffering of its inhabitants. He saw the galaxy's spiral arms becoming streams of pure warp energy, where reality and nightmare blended into a single horrifying whole. He saw humanity not destroyed, but transformed into something that retained their capacity for suffering, while losing everything that made them human. "This is what we face, if the ritual succeeds," the Emperor said, as the visions faded. "Not conquest, but fundamental transformation of existence according to the will of beings whose hunger can never be satisfied." "Then you truly have no choice," Malcador whispered. "The third path is not just preferable, it is necessary." "Yes," the Emperor agreed. "I must sacrifice everything I am to break the connection that makes my sons vulnerable to chaos influence. They will become mortal, yes, but they will be free to choose their own destinies without the whispers of ancient gods clouding their judgment." Sanguinius stepped forward, his wings rustling with harmonics that spoke of acceptance and tragic resolve. "Father, if you become mortal, you will age and die like any human. The Imperium will lose its God-Emperor, its guiding light, its ultimate protector." "Perhaps," the Emperor replied, "but it will gain something more precious than divine protection. It will gain the freedom to become something greater than I ever envisioned. Humanity led not by a god, but by the best aspects of its own nature." The three most powerful figures in the Imperium stood together in the depths of the imperial palace, contemplating a choice that would determine whether existence itself survived the approaching storm. Outside, reality continued to weaken as the siege intensified, each battle adding more cracks to the barrier between dimensions. Yet perhaps the greatest victory was not defeating one's enemies, but choosing to become something worthy of the sacrifice victory demanded. The Emperor looked upon his son and his oldest friend, seeing in their faces reflections of the resolve that had once carried humanity from Terra to the stars themselves. If he was prepared to sacrifice his godhood for their freedom, then they would stand ready to face whatever future such sacrifice might create. The war for the galaxy's soul had truly begun, and the first decisive battle would be fought not with weapons of war, but with the willingness to let go of power in service of something greater than power itself. The outer defenses of Terra cracked like eggshells beneath the weight of the greatest assault in human history. Across the Cradle World's scarred surface, armies beyond counting clashed in battles that shook the foundations of reality itself. Traitor legions poured through breaches in the Aegis defense line, their ranks swollen with demons that materialized from wounds torn in the fabric of space. Each death fed the growing storm, Each act of violence weakened the barriers between dimensions. Each moment brought the galaxy closer to a transformation that would make existence itself unrecognizable. Yet this was not war as mortals understood it. This was ritual made manifest, sacrifice disguised as conquest, the systematic unmaking of the universe according to the will of hungering gods. Angron led the charge across the Marmax plateau, his massive frame wreathed in the psychic fire of Khorne's blessing. The World Eater's Primarch had become something beyond mortal understanding, his consciousness drowned in an ocean of rage that transcended mere emotion. Around him, reality buckled and twisted, as his presence alone was enough to tear holes in the boundary between the warp and material space. The Imperial fists who met his advance fought with valor that would have been legendary in any other conflict. But as Angron's massive chain axes carved through their ranks, their deaths released psychic energies that spiraled outward in patterns too precise to be accidental. Each fallen defender became a component in a working that stretched across continents. "For the Emperor!" roared Captain Pollux, leading his company in a desperate charge against the demon-infused traitors. His power sword blazed with consecrated light as it carved through corrupted flesh. But for every enemy that fell, two more seemed to take their place. Worse, the very ground beneath their feet had begun to pulse with unnatural rhythms, as if the planet itself was becoming something alive and malevolent. The captain's vox crackled with reports from across the defense line. Each transmission painted a picture of coordinated horror that defied military logic. The enemy was not concentrating forces for breakthrough operations. They were spreading their attacks across precisely calculated coordinates, ensuring maximum psychic resonance rather than tactical advantage. High above the battlefield, Sanguinius engaged Fulgrim in aerial combat that painted impossible colors across Terra's wounded sky. The Blood Angels. Primarch's wings caught thermals rising from burning cities as he danced through the air, avoiding the demon sword strikes of his fallen brother. Each clash of their weapons created aurora effects that should not exist in Terra's atmosphere, spectrum frequencies that hurt mortal eyes to observe directly. "You were beautiful once," Sanguinius said, as he parried a strike that would have decapitated a lesser being. "Before the warp thing claimed your soul." Fulgrim's perfect features twisted into an expression that combined ecstasy and agony in equal measure. "Beautiful? Brother, I am beauty perfected. I am sensation given form. When the ritual completes, when reality becomes art, you will understand what we have achieved." Their battle carved aerial patterns across the sky that corresponded to geometric formulas older than human civilization. Each maneuver, each strike, each moment of psychic resonance added another component to the vast workings that centered on the Imperial Palace. Even their words carried harmonic frequencies that contributed to the ritual's growing power. Below them, reality continued its slow dissolution. In the deepest sanctum beneath the Imperial Palace, the Emperor began his counter-ritual with tools that had never been meant for mortal hands. The Eldar soul stones that Vulcan had retrieved pulsed with captured life essence, each one containing the preserved consciousness of an alien who had died fighting against chaos corruption. Their accumulated psychic energy provided the foundation for a working that would either save the galaxy or damn it beyond redemption. Ancient machinery hummed around him as he prepared to channel forces that predated human civilization. The power he had stolen from the chaos gods on Moloch stirred within his divine essence, recognizing the approach of its original masters. Soon, very soon, he would have to return what he had taken. The price of that return would be everything he had become across 10 millennia of godhood. "Father." The voice belonged to Rogel Dawn, who stood in the chamber's entrance with his scarred features marked by lines of growing comprehension. The Imperial Fist's Primarch had spent hours analyzing the mathematical precision of the enemy assault patterns, and his tactical genius had led him to conclusions that filled him with dread. "You know," the Emperor said, without turning from his preparations, "you have seen the pattern." I have seen that every enemy attack follows coordinates that serve no military purpose, Dawn replied, his voice carrying harmonics of barely controlled anguish. I have seen our defenders positioned exactly where the enemy requires them to be. I have seen that this entire battle is a ritual, and we are its willing participants. The Emperor finally faced his son, golden radiance dimming to reveal features marked by the weight of impossible choices. What would you have me do, Rogel? Abandon terror? Allow the ritual to complete unopposed? I would have you tell me the truth about what you're planning. Dawn stepped fully into the chamber, his massive frame blocking the only exit. These artifacts, this machinery, the way you've positioned our forces despite tactical disadvantage. You're not just defending terror. You're preparing to counter their ritual with one of your own. Yes, the Emperor confirmed. I am preparing to sacrifice everything I am to break the warp connection that makes my sons vulnerable to chaos influence. It is the only way to stop what approaches. Understanding and horror warred in Dawn's enhanced features. You would make us mortal, all of us, loyal and traitor alike. I would make you free, the Emperor corrected. Free to choose your own destinies without the whispers of ancient gods clouding your judgment. Free to be what humanity needs rather than what I designed you to become. Before Dawn could respond, psychic alarms began wailing throughout the chamber. Reality distortion fields spiked to unprecedented levels as something vast and terrible approached the palace. Through the enhanced sensors, they could see the traitor Primarchs converging on the imperial seat like pieces on a cosmic game board, each one driven by compulsions that transcended mere tactical consideration. Mortarion descended from the sky, wreathed in plague clouds that withered everything they touched. Perturabo approached with siege engines that defied the laws of physics, their geometries hurting mortal minds to perceive. Lorgar led processions of word-bearers, whose chanted prayers opened rifts in reality itself. Each traitor Primarch brought with them a piece of the puzzle that would complete the Chaos God's grand working. Yet among them, one figure struggled against the divine compulsions that drove his brothers forward. Magnus the Red stood atop the crystalline spire of his command vessel, his massive frame racked by competing influences that threatened to tear his consciousness apart. Tzeentch's will pressed against his mind like a tide of molten thought, demanding obedience, demanding that he take his place in the ritual pattern that would remake reality according to the Changer's vision. But somewhere in the depths of his shattered psyche, fragments of his original self fought against the daemon that shared his skull. The Scholar King, who had once sought nothing more than knowledge and understanding, found enough clarity to see what the gods truly intended. Not just the corruption of the Imperium, but the transformation of existence itself into a playground for beings whose hunger could never be satisfied. No, Magnus whispered, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air around him crack with psychic discharge. I will not be your puppet. Not in this. The effort to resist Tzeentch's influence sent waves of agony through his enhanced nervous system. Every fiber of his being screamed in protest as he fought against compulsions woven into his very essence. Yet for a few precious moments, his will remained his own. With desperate haste, Magnus reached out through psychic channels toward his loyal brothers. The communication would cost him everything, would leave him defenseless against the demon that claimed his soul. But perhaps, just perhaps, it might provide them with information they needed to understand what they truly faced. His psychic voice reached Sanguinius first, crackling across dimensional barriers with urgent warning. Brothers, hear me while I still can. The ritual requires our deaths in specific sequence. First the loyal, then the traitors, each death creating resonance that feeds into the next. Father plans to counter with sacrifice of his own essence, but the backlash may destroy terror itself. The communication wavered as Tzeentch's influence reasserted itself, clawing its way back through Magnus's consciousness like acid through flesh. His final words carried harmonics of despair and fading hope. Find another way. There must be another way. Do not let our father damn himself for choices that we made. The psychic link severed as the demon reclaimed its host completely. Magnus the Red threw back his head and screamed, but the sound that emerged was no longer entirely human. The Crimson King was lost once more, consumed by powers that had claimed him long before his body fell to Leman Russ on Prospero's burning sands. In the imperial palace, Sanguinius staggered as the psychic communication struck his consciousness like a physical blow. The Blood Angels, Primarchs' prescient gifts, amplified Magnus's warning, showing him visions of what would happen if his father's counter-ritual succeeded. He saw the Emperor's divine essence scatter like burning ash across Terra's sky. He saw the psychic backlash tear through the planet's crust, cracking its surface like a broken egg. He saw victory achieved at a price that might make defeat preferable. "Father," Sanguinius whispered as he entered the sanctum, where the counter-ritual neared completion. "Magnus has warned me. The price of stopping their working may be terror itself." The Emperor paused in his preparations, golden radiance flickering as he absorbed the implications of his son's words. "Show me." Sanguinius shared the visions that Magnus's warning had triggered, images of terror transformed into a dead world, its surface scoured clean by energies released when godhood itself was sacrificed. The Emperor witnessed these potential futures with the calm that came from facing impossible choices throughout 10,000 years of existence. "The risk is acceptable," he said finally. "Better a dead terror than a galaxy consumed by chaos." "Is it?" Sanguinius challenged, his perfect features marked by anguish that went beyond mere physical pain. "Is any victory worth the price of becoming the very thing we fight against? If we destroy terror to save it, how are we different from the traitors who would corrupt it?" The question hung in the air between them, like a blade balanced on its edge. Outside the chamber, the siege continued to rage with intensity that shook the foundations of reality itself. Each death, each moment of psychic resonance, brought the chaos ritual closer to completion. Yet the cure that the Emperor contemplated might prove as destructive as the disease. Time was running out. Choices had to be made, and the fate of existence itself balanced on the edge of decisions that transcended mortal understanding of right and wrong. The Emperor looked upon his most beloved son, and saw reflected in those perfect features the same doubt that gnawed at his own consciousness. Perhaps there was wisdom in uncertainty. Perhaps the greatest strength lay not in the certainty of one's choices, but in the willingness to question them even in the face of ultimate destruction. The war for Terra's soul had reached its crescendo, and the final battle would be fought not with weapons or sorcery, but with the courage to make choices that honored both victory and the price that victory demanded. The moment of ultimate choice arrived with the sound of reality itself, screaming. Horus Lupercal stood at the threshold of the inner palace, his massive frame silhouetted against fires that burned in colors that had no names. Behind him stretched a processional of traitor champions, positioned with mathematical precision across the palace's sacred grounds. Each figure occupied coordinates predetermined by calculations older than human civilization, their combined presence creating a resonance pattern that made the air itself writhe with uncontained energy. The War Master had become something beyond mortal comprehension. 4 divine wills merged within his enhanced consciousness, turning him into a living conduit for powers that predated existence itself. When he spoke, his words carried harmonics that cracked the marble beneath his feet and sent tremors through dimensions that existed only in the spaces between thoughts. "Father!" Horus called across the palace courtyard, his voice reaching through barriers of stone and steel to strike the Emperor's consciousness like a physical blow. "I have come home at last. Will you not welcome your most beloved son?" The taunt carried currents of psychic energy that rippled outward in expanding circles, each wave adding another layer to the grand working that centered on this moment. The Chaos Gods had planned for millennia to position their pieces exactly where they needed to be. Now, with their greatest champion standing at the threshold of the imperial seat, the final phase of their ritual could begin. Above Terra's wounded sky, reality buckled and twisted as the Chaos Gods manifested more directly than they had ever dared before. Corny's presence painted the clouds with the color of spilled blood, while Nurgle's influence caused the very air to thicken with the sweet stench of decay. Tzeentch wove impossible patterns through the stratosphere, and Slanesh's voice sang harmonies that drove mortals to madness across the planet's surface. Their combined attention focused on terror like the weight of collapsing stars, pressing against the barriers between dimensions with force that threatened to crush the material universe beneath its magnitude. Each second of their direct involvement weakened the fundamental laws that kept reality stable. Each moment brought existence itself closer to transformation, according to their limitless hunger. In the deepest sanctum beneath the palace, the Emperor faced the choice that would determine the fate of all things. Before him lay three paths, each leading to different forms of victory and defeat. He could save 5 loyal Primarchs by channeling his divine power to shield them from the ritual's culmination. But that would require allowing 4 traitors to complete their roles in the grand working. Billions would die as chaos corruption spread across the galaxy, but his loyal sons would survive to lead humanity through the darkness that followed. Alternatively, he could sacrifice his loyal sons to ensure the destruction of the 4 traitor Primarchs who posed the greatest threat to the ritual's completion. Their deaths would wound the Chaos Gods deeply, potentially disrupting the working for centuries to come. But the Imperium would be left defenseless, vulnerable to dissolution and conquest by forces that no longer required ritual to achieve their ends. Or he could choose the third path, the one that demanded everything he was in exchange for the freedom of all his children. The Emperor placed his hands upon the Elder Soulstones that Vulcan had retrieved from the dying craftworlds. Ancient alien consciousness stirred within the crystalline artifacts, recognizing the approach of energies that could either save or damn everything they had died to preserve. Their accumulated life essence would provide the foundation for a counter-ritual that would sever all 20 Primarchs from the warp permanently. But the power required to achieve such severance could come from only one source. His own divine nature, the godhood he had stolen from the Chaos Gods themselves on Moloch, would have to be returned to them in a way that would break their hold on his sons forever. He would become mortal. He would age and die like any human. The Imperium would lose its God-Emperor, its guiding light, its ultimate protector, but his children would be free to choose their own destinies without the whispers of ancient gods clouding their judgment. The Emperor began to channel his divine essence into the counter-ritual, feeling 10,000 years of accumulated power flow out of him like lifeblood from a mortal wound. Each expenditure of energy aged his physical form visibly, lines appearing on features that had remained unchanged since before the rise of human civilization. Yet even as his immortal strength faded, his resolve remained unbroken. This was the choice he had always known he would have to make. Not as a god preserving his dominion, but as a father protecting his children from the consequences of gifts he should never have given them. "Father, no!" The voice belonged to Sanguinius, who burst into the sanctum with his perfect features marked by anguish that transcended mere emotion. By the blood angels, Primarch's prescient gifts had shown him what his father intended, and the knowledge filled him with horror that went beyond the fear of death itself. "You cannot do this," Sanguinius continued, his wings rustling with harmonics of desperate pleading. "If you sacrifice your godhood, you will die. Not just become mortal, but die. The backlash from severing so many warp connections simultaneously will kill you instantly." The Emperor paused in his ritual preparations, golden radiance flickering as he met his son's gaze. "I know." "Then why?" Sanguinius demanded. "Why choose death when there are other options?" "Because those other options require me to choose which of my children live and which die," the Emperor replied. "Because they demand that I place my own survival above the freedom of those I created to serve humanity's future. Because there are some prices that even a god-emperor cannot ask others to pay." Understanding dawned in Sanguinius's perfect features. His father was not choosing death over victory. He was choosing love over power, sacrifice over dominion, the freedom of his children over his own immortal existence. "Then we stand with you," Sanguinius said, his voice carrying harmonics of absolute resolve. "If you will sacrifice everything for our freedom, we will sacrifice everything to give you the time you need." Before the Emperor could protest, alarms began wailing throughout the palace. The traitor forces had breached the final defensive lines. Horus approached the throne room itself, bringing with him champions whose combined presence would complete the geometric pattern that the Chaos Gods required for their grand working. The loyal Primarchs converged on the palace's central chambers with speed that blurred the boundaries between matter and energy. Rogel Dawn arrived first, his scarred features set in lines of grim determination. Jagatai Khan followed, moving with the fluid grace of wind across the steppes. Leman Russ came with fangs bared and frost trailing from his weapons. Lionel Johnson materialized from shadows that seemed deeper than mere absence of light. Vulcan emerged from the palace depths, his massive frame wreathed in flames that burned without consuming. "Brothers," Sanguinius said as they assembled in the antechamber to the throne room, "Father sacrifices his godhood to free us from the warp's influence. We must give him the time he needs, no matter the cost." The loyal Primarchs absorbed this information with the tactical minds that had conquered worlds in their father's name. They understood immediately what was being asked of them. They would have to fight their traitor brothers not to win, but to delay. Not to achieve victory, but to purchase time with their own lives if necessary. "How long does he need?" Dawn asked, his fortress builder's mind already calculating defensive positions and fallback routes. "Minutes," Sanguinius replied. "Perhaps less. But those minutes will determine whether existence itself survives what approaches." The Khan's scarred features twisted into something that might have been a smile. "Then we make those minutes count." Through the palace walls, they could hear the approach of their fallen brothers. Horus's voice carried across dimensional barriers, calling challenges that resonated with power stolen from gods older than worlds. Mortarian's plague winds seeped through cracks in reality itself, carrying diseases that consumed not just flesh, but hope. Perturabo's siege engines thundered against defenses designed to withstand the fury of entire star systems. Yet the loyal Primarchs felt no fear. They had been created to stand against forces that would break lesser beings. They had conquered the galaxy in their father's name, faced horrors that would drive mortals to madness, stood firm against enemies that existed beyond the boundaries of rational thought. Now they would face their greatest test, not as conquerors seeking glory, but as sons protecting a father who had chosen to give up everything to ensure their freedom. The Emperor's counter-ritual reached its critical phase, divine essence flowing out of him in streams of golden light that struck the elder soul stones with force that made them sing like crystal bells. Each note in that impossible harmony corresponded to frequencies that existed only in the deepest layers of the warp, resonances that could sever the connections binding his sons to powers beyond mortal comprehension. His physical form began to change as godhood drained from flesh that had remained perfect for millennia. Lines appeared around his eyes. His golden hair dulled to mortal brown. The radiance that had surrounded him since before recorded history flickered and dimmed like a candle guttering in cosmic wind. Yet his will remained unbroken. His love for his children burned brighter than any divine fire, and his resolve to see them free from the chains he had forged in ignorance remained absolute. The throne room doors exploded inward as Horus led his chosen champions into the heart of the imperial palace. The War Master's presence alone was enough to crack the ancient stone, his chaos-enhanced form radiating energies that made reality buckle and twist around him. "Father," Horus called across the vast chamber, "the time for games has ended. Choose now. Save your loyal sons and watch the galaxy burn, or sacrifice them to stop what cannot be stopped. Either way, you lose." But the Emperor was no longer listening to his fallen sons' taunts. His attention had turned inward, focused entirely on the working that would either damn or save everything he had ever sought to protect. The moment of choice had arrived, and the Master of Mankind chose love. The transformation began with light bleeding from the Emperor's eyes like tears of molten gold. Divine essence flowed out of him in streams of radiance that struck the Elder Soul Stones with force that made reality itself ring like a struck bell. Each pulse of expelled godhood aged his perfect features by decades, millennia of immortal existence, draining away to power, a working that would either save or damn everything he had ever sought to protect. His hair, once golden as the light of Terra's sun, dulled to mortal brown, streaked with silver. Lines carved themselves across features that had remained unchanged since before human civilization crawled from the ashes of old night. His towering frame began to diminish, superhuman musculature fading to the proportions of the man he had been before he stole power from gods older than worlds. Yet his will remained absolute. His love for his children burned brighter than any divine fire, and his determination to see them free from the chains he had forged in ignorance never wavered, even as the strength to enforce that determination bled away with each passing moment. The counter-ritual reached frequencies that existed only in the deepest layers of the warp, harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. Each note in that impossible symphony targeted the connections binding his 20 sons to powers that predated existence itself. The Eldar Soul Stones sang with crystalline voices as alien consciousness merged with human will in service of a purpose that transcended the boundaries between species. Across the throne room, Horus felt the change like ice spreading through his enhanced veins. The War Master's connection to the Chaos Gods began to weaken as the Emperor's working took hold. Divine voices that had thundered in his consciousness for years suddenly grew distant. Their commands filtered through layers of interference that seemed to thicken with each passing second. The supernatural enhancements that Chaos had granted him flickered like flames in wind, leaving him momentarily uncertain of his own strength. "What are you doing?" Horus roared, his voice carrying harmonics of divine fury, mixed with very mortal fear. "What are you doing to us?" Understanding struck him like a physical blow. His father was not defending against the chaos ritual. He was countering it with a working of his own, one that targeted the very source of the traitor Primarchs' power. The realization filled Horus with rage that transcended his chaos enhancements, fury born not of divine influence, but of a son's betrayal by a father he had once loved above all things. "You would make us mortal," Horus snarled, raising his weapon with hands that no longer blazed with supernatural fire. "You would strip away everything we have become, rather than accept what we chose to be. I would free you from choices made under the influence of beings that view your souls as currency," the Emperor replied, his voice growing weaker as more divine essence flowed into the counter-ritual. "I would give you back the will to choose your own destinies." Horus launched himself across the throne room with speed that still blurred the boundaries between matter and energy, but his movement lacked the impossible grace that chaos enhancement had granted him. Behind him came the other traitor champions, their own supernatural abilities flickering and fading as the Emperor's working spread its influence through dimensions beyond physical reality. The loyal Primarchs met them at the chamber's center, in a clash that shook the foundations of the imperial palace. Sanguinius engaged Fulgrim in aerial combat that painted impossible colors across the throne room's vaulted ceiling. The Blood Angel's Primarch's wings caught thermals that should not exist in enclosed space as he danced through the air, his blade leaving trails of golden fire that carved reality itself. Yet each strike came at greater cost as his own warp-enhanced abilities began to fade, leaving him to rely on skill and courage rather than superhuman might. "You were beautiful once," Sanguinius said, as he parried a blow that would have opened his throat. "Before the demon claimed your soul. You could be beautiful again." Fulgrim's perfect features twisted with expressions that combined ecstasy and agony in equal measure. "Beautiful? I am beauty perfected, sensation given divine form. Yet the voices grow quiet. Why do the voices grow quiet?" Their battle-carved patterns across 3 dimensions, as enhanced senses that had once perceived spectrums beyond mortal comprehension, began to fail. Each combatant found themselves reduced to mere physical prowess, superhuman still, but no longer touched by powers that existed beyond the boundaries of natural law. Across the chamber, Rogal Dorn faced Perturabo in a duel that echoed the siege warfare they had perfected across centuries of campaign. The master of fortification met the master of siegecraft in combat that transcended mere personal animosity. Their weapons struck with force that cracked the ancient stone beneath their feet, yet both fighters found their enhanced strength diminishing with each exchange. "You always resented me," Dorn said, as he blocked a strike that would have shattered mortal bones. "Resented that Father trusted me with Terra's defense while you were sent to break enemies on distant worlds. I resented that you received praise for building what I was never allowed to create," Perturabo replied, his bitter words carrying less venom than they once had. "Yet now I find myself wondering if that resentment was ever truly mine, or if it was fed by voices that promised understanding, but delivered only rage." Their duel continued with mechanical precision, 2 masters of warfare testing themselves against an equal opponent, while the supernatural abilities that had defined them for centuries continued to fade like morning mist. In the depths of the palace, Malcador the Sigillite felt the moment when the Emperor's attention turned entirely to the counter-ritual and away from maintaining the Astronomicon. The ancient psyker understood immediately what was required of him. Without hesitation, he placed his weathered hands upon the controls of the psychic beacon that guided human navigation across the galaxy. Pain beyond mortal comprehension flooded through his consciousness as he attempted to channel forces that had been designed for a god-emperor's will. The Astronomicon required power that no mortal mind could contain indefinitely, energies that would burn through human neural pathways like acid through flesh. Yet Malcador held firm, drawing upon reserves of strength that he had accumulated across 7,000 years of loyal service. "Hold, old friend," he whispered to machinery that hummed with barely contained forces. "Hold just long enough for him to finish what he has begun." The strain began to consume him from within, aging his ancient frame with each passing moment. Yet he felt no fear, only pride that he could serve one final time in service of a vision that had guided humanity from Terra to the stars themselves. Above, the battle for the throne room raged with intensity that shook reality itself. Magnus the Red stood at the chamber's edge, his massive frame racked by competing influences that no longer held their former power. The daemon that shared his consciousness struggled to maintain its grip as the Emperor's working severed connections that had been forged in desperation and sealed in blood. For the first time in years, fragments of the Crimson King's original personality surfaced like islands in a receding tide. "Father," Magnus whispered, his voice carrying harmonics of recognition and profound regret. "I see what you are doing. I see what it costs you. And I remember who I was before the voices claimed me." The effort to speak clearly sent waves of agony through his enhanced nervous system as the demon fought to reassert control. Yet for these precious moments, his will remained his own, and with that freedom came the horrifying clarity of what he had become. "Forgive me," he continued, tears of liquid fire streaming down his altered features. "Forgive me for the choices I made in ignorance and pride. If this working succeeds, if you free us from the chains we forged for ourselves, I swear by what remains of my soul that I will spend whatever time remains to me seeking redemption for the harm I have caused." His words reached the Emperor's consciousness even as divine essence continued to drain from his immortal frame. For a moment, golden eyes met crimson ones across the chaos of battle, and in that gaze passed forgiveness that transcended the boundaries between father and son, creator and creation, god and mortal. Yet the Chaos Gods would not surrender their prizes without a final, desperate gambit. Reality convulsed as the four great powers poured more energy into their champions than they had ever risked before, the chamber filled with impossible geometries, as Tzeentch warped space itself into configurations that hurt mortal minds to perceive. Khorne's rage painted the air with colors that existed only in the moment when life became death. Nurgle's patience manifested as time that moved in spirals rather than straight lines. Slanesh's perfection sang harmonies that made the very atoms vibrate in patterns too precise for natural law. Their combined attention focused on the throne room with force that began to tear holes in reality, far beyond Terra's atmosphere. Across the solar system, minor worlds cracked beneath the pressure of divine regard. Space itself began to buckle and twist as the fundamental laws governing existence strained beneath the weight of powers that had never before worked in such perfect unity. Yet their intervention came too late. The Emperor's counter-ritual had reached critical mass, and no amount of divine fury could stop what he had set in motion. The connections binding his 20 sons to the warp began to sever one by one, each break accompanied by psychic shockwaves that rippled through dimensions beyond physical reality. The Primarchs felt their superhuman abilities fade, not as loss, but as liberation from influences they had never fully understood. They became what they had always been, beneath the enhancements their father had woven into their genetic matrix. Exceptional mortals touched by greatness, but no longer bound by the will of hungering gods. The Emperor collapsed to his knees as the final pulse of divine essence flowed out of him and into the working that would free his children forever. His mortal frame, no longer sustained by godhood stolen from chaos itself, began to fail beneath the strain of what he had accomplished. Yet in his fading eyes burned satisfaction that transcended any victory he had achieved across 10,000 years of existence. His sons were free. The galaxy would endure. And perhaps, in time, humanity would become something greater than even he had envisioned. The war for existence itself had reached its turning point, and victory had been purchased not with power, but with the willingness to sacrifice everything in service of love itself. The moment came with a silence deeper than the void between stars. Across the throne room of the imperial palace, 20 demigods felt the connections that had defined their existence for 2 centuries suddenly sever like chains broken by an irresistible force. The warp-enhanced abilities that had made them more than mortal drained away in an instant, leaving them standing as exceptional humans rather than living gods. The change struck both loyal and traitor alike, transforming the nature of their battle from cosmic struggle to intensely personal conflict between brothers who had chosen different paths through darkness. The Emperor's counter-ritual reached its crescendo as the final threads binding his sons to powers beyond mortal comprehension snapped like overstretched cables. Golden light blazed from the Eldar soul stones with intensity that made the air itself sing, each crystalline artifact releasing stored life essence in service of a working that rewrote the fundamental nature of enhanced human existence. Yet the price of that working became apparent with each passing second. The Emperor's mortal frame, no longer sustained by divine power, stolen from chaos itself, began to collapse beneath the strain of channeling forces that no human body could contain. His skin grew pale as aged parchment. His breathing became labored, each inhalation a visible effort that sent tremors through his failing form. He was dying, not as a god might die in cosmic battle against equal powers, but as a mortal man might die from exhaustion and the simple failure of flesh to sustain spirit. Yet his eyes remained fixed on the ritual's completion, his will unbroken even as his body surrendered to the inevitable. Across the chamber, the transformation's effects became immediately apparent in the combatants who had defined the fate of the galaxy. Horus staggered as divine enhancements, granted by 4 chaos gods, simultaneously drained from his enhanced frame. The supernatural strength that had allowed him to shatter ceramite with his bare hands faded to merely exceptional mortal prowess. The prescient awareness that had made him untouchable in combat reduced to the enhanced reflexes of a supremely trained warrior. The aura of command that had bent lesser minds to his will became nothing more than the charisma of a born leader. For the first time in years, Horus Lupercal stood as himself, rather than as a vessel for powers that predated human civilization. The clarity of that moment struck him with force that transcended any physical blow he had ever received. He saw clearly what he had become, what choices he had made under the influence of beings whose hunger could never be satisfied. And in that seeing came a grief so profound it threatened to crush his mortal heart. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice carrying no superhuman harmonics, only the anguish of a son who had betrayed everything he once held sacred. "Father, what have I done?" Yet there was no time for contemplation. Sanguinius approached with blade raised, his perfect features marked by determination that transcended mere duty. The Blood Angel's Primarch had also lost his warp-enhanced abilities, but his resolve remained absolute. The prescient visions that had plagued him for months had finally ceased, leaving him free to act according to his own will rather than the weight of predetermined fate. "Brother," Sanguinius said, as he engaged Horus in single combat that lacked their former superhuman grace but carried far greater emotional weight. "You chose this path. You led our brothers into darkness. You brought damnation to the galaxy in service of powers that view mortal souls as currency." Their blades met with ringing that echoed through dimensions beyond physical reality, yet the sound carried no warp-enhanced resonance. This was combat as mortals understood it, skill against skill, will against will, brother against brother, with all the cosmic enhancements stripped away to reveal the men they had always been beneath the gifts their father had woven into their genetic matrix. "I know," Horus replied as he parried a strike that would have opened his throat. "I remember now. I remember choosing darkness over light, corruption over purity, the promises of ancient gods over loyalty to the Father who created us. And I remember that those choices were mine, regardless of the voices that encouraged them." Around them, other Primarchs grappled with the same fundamental transformation from divine to mortal nature. Fulgrim found himself fighting without the supernatural grace that Slaanesh had granted him, his perfect features no longer enhanced by demonic influence, but bearing the simple beauty of human artistry perfected through genetic craft. The realization that his pursuit of sensation had led him to embrace corruption rather than transcendence struck him like a physical blow. "I was magnificent," he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying grief for glories that had proven false. "I thought I was becoming something greater than mortal. Instead, I became less than human." Perturabo discovered that his bitterness, while still present, no longer carried the supernatural edge that chaos influence had provided. The resentment that had driven him to betray his father remained, but it felt smaller now, more manageable, the grudge of a man rather than the eternal fury of a demon-touched demigod. "I chose this," he admitted, as he fought Rogel Dawn with skill unmarked by superhuman enhancement. Not because ancient powers whispered in my ears, but because I preferred the comfort of resentment to the difficulty of forgiveness. That knowledge changes nothing, yet it changes everything. Yet the most profound transformation occurred in Magnus the Red, whose consciousness had been divided between his original personality and the daemon that shared his skull. As Tzeentch's influence severed completely, the Crimson King found himself whole for the first time since his fall. The clarity of unified thought struck him with force that brought tears of liquid fire to his altered features. "I am free," Magnus whispered, his voice carrying harmonics of wonder and profound relief. "For the first time in years, I am truly free." The freedom lasted only moments before Lorgar Aurelian struck him down with a blow that shattered enhanced bone and spilled ichor across the throne room's ancient stone. The word-bearer's Primarch, deprived of his own chaos enhancements, fought with the desperate fury of a zealot whose gods had abandoned him in his moment of greatest need. "Traitor," Lorgar snarled as he stood over Magnus's fallen form. "You would betray the powers that raised us above mortal limitations. You would choose servitude to our father over the freedom that chaos offers." Magnus looked up at his brother with eyes that held no trace of supernatural fire, only human pain and very mortal regret. "I choose redemption over damnation," he replied, his voice growing weak as life drained from wounds that would have been trivial when he possessed demonic resilience. "I choose to die as myself, rather than live as someone else's puppet." Lorgar raised his weapon for the killing blow, but Vulcan's massive frame interposed itself between the word-bearer and his fallen brother. The Salamander's Primarch moved with the deliberate grace of a master craftsman rather than the impossible speed of a demigod, yet his resolve remained unshaken by the loss of supernatural abilities. "No more," Vulcan said, his voice carrying the deep harmonics of forge fire and creation rather than warp-enhanced power. "We have shed enough blood in service of beings who view our souls as commodities. Let this end with choices made freely rather than compulsions imposed by hungering gods." The battle continued to rage throughout the throne room, but its nature had fundamentally changed. No longer did demigods clash in combat that shook reality itself. Instead, exceptional mortals fought with skills honed across centuries of warfare, their conflict terrible in its human scale rather than its cosmic significance. Reality stabilized around them as warp influence receded like a tide, withdrawing from shores it had never been meant to touch. The impossible geometries that had warped the chamber's architecture straightened into forms that mortal minds could comprehend. The aurora effects that had painted the air with spectrums beyond human perception faded to leave simple light and shadow. The harmonics that had carried meaning across dimensions beyond physical reality quieted to leave only the sounds of mortal combat echoing through ancient stone. Yet victory came at a price that neither side had fully anticipated. The loyal Primarchs found themselves bereft not just of supernatural abilities, but of the certainty that divine purpose had once provided. They were free to choose their own destinies, yes, but with that freedom came the terrible responsibility of making those choices without guidance from powers beyond mortal comprehension. The traitor Primarchs faced an even more profound crisis. Stripped of the enhancements that chaos had provided, they confronted the full weight of what they had done without the comfort of divine compulsion to excuse their actions. Each recognized that their choices had been their own, regardless of the voices that had encouraged them toward darkness. At the chamber's center, the Emperor collapsed completely as the counter-ritual reached its conclusion. His mortal frame could no longer sustain the effort of channeling forces that existed beyond the boundaries of human endurance. Golden radiance flickered and died around him like a candle guttering in cosmic wind, leaving behind a man rather than a god. "It is finished," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sounds of continuing battle. "My sons are free. Whatever choices they make now will be their own, unmarked by the influence of beings whose hunger predates existence itself." Malcador's voice reached him through failing Vox systems, the ancient Psyker's words marked by exhaustion that spoke of ultimate sacrifice. "The Astronomicon holds, my lord, but not for much longer. The strain is beyond mortal endurance." "You have done enough, old friend," the Emperor replied. "Let it fail if it must. Humanity will find other ways to navigate the stars. They will find their own path to greatness without gods to guide them." Around them, the battle began to wind down as both loyal and traitor Primarchs came to terms with their transformed nature. They were no longer the demigods who had conquered the galaxy in their father's name. They were men, exceptional beyond mortal understanding, but men nonetheless, faced with choices that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of human civilization itself. The war that had torn the galaxy apart for 7 years was ending, not with triumph or defeat, but with the recognition that perhaps the greatest victory lay in the freedom to choose one's own destiny without the whispers of ancient gods to cloud that choice. Yet freedom, as the Emperor had always known, carried its own terrible weight, and the choices his sons would make in the coming hours would determine whether his sacrifice had purchased salvation or merely exchanged one form of damnation for another. The galaxy held its breath, waiting to see what mortals might accomplish when freed from the chains that gods had forged for their protection. The final duel began, not with the thunder of gods at war, but with the whispered grief of brothers who had lost their way. Horus and Sanguinius faced each other across the throne room's ancient stone, their weapons raised not in superhuman fury, but in the terrible certainty of mortals who understood that only one of them would see another dawn. The War Master's blade no longer blazed with the fire of 4 chaos gods. The Blood Angel's sword carried no prescient gleam of futures yet to be written. They were men now, exceptional beyond mortal understanding, but men nonetheless, and their conflict had become something far more profound than cosmic struggle between competing divine wills. "It didn't have to be this way," Sanguinius said, his perfect features marked by sorrow that transcended mere regret. "We could have chosen differently. All of us. We could have remained the sons our father intended us to be." Horus met his brother's gaze, with eyes that held no trace of supernatural fire, only human pain and the weight of choices that could never be undone. "Yes," he agreed, his voice carrying harmonics of profound loss. "But we chose pride over wisdom, ambition over loyalty, the promises of ancient powers over the love of the Father who created us, and those choices were ours, regardless of the voices that encouraged them." Their first exchange of blows rang through the chamber with sound that carried no warp-enhanced resonance, yet struck with greater emotional force than any supernatural combat they had ever witnessed. Each parry, each strike, each moment of perfect balance between matched opponents spoke not of divine destiny, but of human tragedy played out on a stage vast enough to encompass the fate of civilizations. Sanguinius fought with the grace of an angel, made mortal, his movements flowing like poetry written in violence. Yet each strike cost him more than superhuman enhancement had ever demanded. His mortal frame, no longer sustained by warp-granted resilience, began to show the strain of combat against an opponent whose skill had been honed across 2 centuries of warfare. Horus pressed his advantage with the tactical brilliance that had made him War Master of the greatest military force in human history. Yet his heart was not in the victory he sought. With each blow he struck against his beloved brother. With each drop of blood he drew from flesh that had once seemed inviolable, He felt another piece of his soul crumble beneath the weight of what he had become. "Forgive me," Horus whispered, as his blade found its mark, opening a wound across Sanguinius's shoulder that would have been trivial when enhanced by divine power, but now threatened to cripple mortal flesh. "Forgive me for what I have done to our family, to you, to Father, to the dream we once shared." "I forgave you long ago," Sanguinius replied, his own sword drawing crimson lines across Horus's arms as they fought. "The question that remains is whether you can forgive yourself." Across the chamber, other conflicts reached their own tragic conclusions. Rogel Dawn and Perturabo clashed in a battle that distilled the essence of their natures to pure tactical skill, unmarked by superhuman enhancement. The master of fortification met the master of siegecraft in combat that transcended personal animosity to become a philosophical argument conducted with weapons rather than words. "You built walls," Perturabo said, as he struck with mechanical precision that spoke of decades spent perfecting the art of destruction. Always walls. Never the cities that might shelter behind them, never the culture that might flourish in their protection. Only barriers to keep the universe at bay. "I built what was needed," Dawn replied, his defense as methodical as the fortifications he had raised on 10,000 worlds. "Walls to protect what others created, foundations upon which greater things might be built. The infrastructure that allows civilization to flourish." Their weapons met with ringing that echoed the fundamental conflict between creation and destruction, protection and conquest, the desire to build something lasting versus the hunger to tear down what others had achieved. Yet beneath the philosophical dispute lay a simpler truth. Two brothers who had chosen different responses to the burden of existence. "I resented you," Perturabo admitted, as their duel continued. "Resented that Father gave you the honor of defending his greatest work, while I was sent to break the enemies he could not be bothered to face personally. But the resentment was mine to choose. The bitterness was mine to nurture, and the betrayal was mine to embrace." "Yes," Dawn agreed, his scarred features softening with something that might have been compassion. "But choices can be remade. Even now, even after everything that has happened, you could choose differently." The offer hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. For a moment, Perturabo's mechanical precision wavered as he considered possibilities that had seemed closed forever. Yet the weight of yours spent in service to chaos, the accumulated guilt of worlds broken beneath his hammer, proved too great for redemption achieved in a single moment. "Too late," Perturabo said, his voice carrying harmonics of profound sadness. "Some choices echo too loudly to be taken back." Their battle continued with grim determination, two masters of warfare testing themselves against an equal opponent, while the galaxy itself held its breath, waiting for resolution. At the chamber's heart, the Emperor faced the completion of his counter-ritual with the calm that came from sacrificing everything in service of love. The final threads of connection between his sons and the warp severed with sounds like crystal bells ringing across dimensions, each note carrying the liberation of a soul freed from chains it had never fully understood. Golden light blazed one final time from the Eldar Soulstones as alien consciousness merged completely with human will in service of a working that transcended the boundaries between species. The crystalline artifacts cracked and shattered as they released the last of their stored life essence, their sacrifice complete, their purpose fulfilled. Across the galaxy, the effects were immediate and profound. On distant worlds where imperial defenders had fought hopeless battles against impossible odds, chaos forces suddenly faltered as their supernatural enhancements failed. Demons that had walked freely among mortals found themselves banished back to the warp as reality reasserted its fundamental laws. Space Marines who had served the Dark Gods for years looked upon their actions with clarity, unmarked by divine compulsion, and chose to lay down their weapons rather than continue fighting for causes they no longer believed in. The great ritual that the Chaos gods had spent decades orchestrating collapsed like a house of cards built on foundations of lies and false promises. The psychic energy they had accumulated across 7 years of civil war dissipated harmlessly into the void, no longer able to tear holes in reality's fabric or transform the galaxy according to their hungering will. Yet victory came at the ultimate price. The Emperor collapsed completely as the counter-ritual reached its conclusion, his mortal frame unable to sustain the effort required to channel forces that existed beyond human endurance. The divine radiance that had surrounded him since before recorded history flickered and died, leaving behind a man who looked every day of his 50,000 years of existence. "It is finished," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sounds of continuing combat. "My sons are free. The galaxy endures. And perhaps in time, humanity will become something greater than even I envisioned." Horus broke away from his duel with Sanguinius as he heard his father's words. The War Master turned to see the Emperor lying upon the throne room's ancient stone. No longer the God Emperor who had united humanity beneath a single banner, but simply a dying man who had given everything to protect his children from the consequences of gifts he should never have given them. "Father," Horus said, his voice breaking with emotion that no divine enhancement could have contained. "What have I done? What have we all done?" The Emperor looked upon his most beloved son with eyes that held no trace of condemnation, only the profound sadness of a parent who had watched his children destroy themselves through choices he had been unable to prevent. "You chose your own path," the Emperor replied, each word costing him visible effort. "All of you chose. And perhaps that freedom to choose, even to choose wrongly, is worth any price. Even this one." Horus knelt beside his father's failing form, tears streaming down features that bore no trace of supernatural enhancement. "I would take it back," he whispered. "All of it. The rebellion, the corruption, the years of war. I would choose differently if I could." "I know," the Emperor said, his hand reaching out to touch his son's face with gentleness that transcended any power he had ever wielded. "And perhaps that knowledge is enough. Perhaps the capacity for regret is what makes us human, rather than mere weapons given consciousness." Around them, the battle gradually ceased as both loyal and traitor Primarchs came to terms with what had occurred. They were no longer the demigods who had conquered the galaxy in their father's name. They were men who had made choices, some wise, some foolish, all their own. And with the freedom to choose came the responsibility to live with the consequences of those choices. The war that had torn the galaxy apart for 7 years was ending, not in triumph or defeat, but in the recognition that perhaps the greatest victory was the freedom to make one's own mistakes and learn from them. Yet as the Emperor's life faded like a candle, guttering in cosmic wind, those who remained faced a question that would define the future of human civilization. What would they build from the ashes of the dreams that gods had dreamed for them? The galaxy waited for their answer, and for the first time in human history, that answer would be entirely their own. Victory came not with triumph, but with the sound of a father's final breath echoing through chambers that had witnessed the birth and death of gods. The Emperor died as he had lived in his final moments, not as the master of mankind, but as a father who had given everything to protect his children from forces they could not comprehend. His mortal frame, no longer sustained by divine power, stolen from chaos itself, simply ceased. There were no wounds from Horus's blade, no dramatic confrontation that poets might celebrate in ages to come. Only the quiet failure of flesh that had been asked to contain energies beyond human endurance. His last words were whispered to Horus, who knelt beside the failing form, with tears streaming down features unmarked by supernatural enhancement. "You are free now," the Emperor said, his voice barely audible above the settling silence that followed the end of cosmic war. "All of you are free. Make of that freedom something worthy of the price it demanded." The War Master felt his father's final breath like a physical blow to his mortal heart. The full weight of what he had done, what choices he had made, under the influence of beings whose promises had proven false, crashed over him like a tide of molten regret. Without the divine enhancements that had shielded him from the consequences of his actions, Horus confronted the accumulated guilt of 7 years spent tearing apart everything he had once held sacred. "Father," Horus whispered, his voice breaking with emotion that no God-granted power could have contained. "Forgive me. Please forgive me." But the Emperor could no longer hear his son's pleas. The master of mankind was gone, leaving behind only the memory of golden radiance and the echo of choices made in love rather than fear. Horus collapsed beside his father's still form, his massive frame racked by sobs that spoke of grief too profound for mortal expression. The weight of understanding what he had destroyed, what he had betrayed, what he had chosen in ignorance and pride, proved too great for even his enhanced constitution to bear. His hearts, no longer sustained by the blessings of 4 chaos gods, simply stopped beating beneath the crushing burden of absolute regret. The War Master died not in battle against his father, not in defiant rage against powers that had used him as a tool for cosmic destruction, but in grief for choices that could never be undone, and love that had been betrayed beyond repair. Around them, the surviving Primarchs grappled with the reality of their transformed existence. Sanguinius knelt beside both fallen figures, his perfect features marked by tears that carried no prescient knowledge of futures yet to be written. The Blood Angel's Primarch had lost not just his supernatural abilities, but the burden of visions that had plagued him since childhood. For the first time in 2 centuries, he faced uncertainty about what tomorrow might bring, and found that uncertainty strangely liberating. "They are gone," he said, his voice carrying harmonics of profound loss mixed with tentative hope. "Both of them are gone, the Father who created us, and the brother who led us astray. We are alone now, free to choose our own path through whatever comes next." The loyal Primarchs who had survived the final battle stood in silent contemplation of what they had gained and lost. Rogel Dawn, his scarred features marked by exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue, studied the architectural damage the battle had inflicted on the throne room he had helped design. Each crack in the ancient stone spoke of power unleashed in service of purposes that transcended mere conquest. "We defended Terra," Dawn said eventually, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a fortress builder, assessing structural integrity. "But what we defended it for no longer exists. The Imperium as our father envisioned it died with him." Jagatai Khan, his wild features marked by the wisdom of Stepp's Wind and Starpath, nodded in agreement. "Then we must envision something new, something that honors his sacrifice without being bound by his limitations." Leman Russ, the Wolf King's fanged features softened by very mortal grief, spoke with the directness that had always marked his nature. "He freed us from the chains he forged for our protection. But chains and freedom both carry prices. The question that remains is whether we are wise enough to pay them. Among the traitor Primarchs, the reckoning proved more complex and painful. Perturabo stood over his hammer, no longer wreathed in the bitter resentment that Chaos influence had amplified. The Iron Warrior's Primarch looked upon the destruction he had wrought with eyes unclouded by supernatural rage, and found himself confronting choices that were entirely his own. "I chose this path," he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying harmonics of recognition and profound regret. "Not because ancient powers whispered in my ears, but because I preferred the comfort of grievance to the difficulty of acceptance. The voices merely encouraged what was already in my heart." Mortarion, freed from Nurgle's patient corruption, found himself breathing clean air for the first time in years, The Death Guard, Primarchs' enhanced respiratory system, no longer filtering plague winds from the realm of decay, processed the simple atmosphere of terror with something approaching wonder. I sought knowledge of death because I feared it, Mortarion admitted, his scarred features marked by the clarity that came with freedom from divine compulsion. I embraced corruption because it promised control over the one thing that all mortals must face. Yet now, confronting genuine mortality without supernatural protection, I find the fear less terrible than the certainty I once sought. Not all of the surviving traitor Primarchs found redemption in their moment of liberation. Lorgar, the word-bearer's Primarch, whose zealotry had sparked the entire heresy, looked upon the scene of devastation with eyes that burned with undiminished fanaticism. "This changes nothing," Lorgar declared, his voice carrying the fervor of a true believer whose faith had survived even the abandonment of his gods. "The Emperor may have freed us from divine influence, but the truths I discovered remain unchanged. Chaos exists, the warp hungers, and humanity will face that hunger with or without supernatural protection." Vulcan, his massive frame, unmarked by forge fire that no longer blazed with inhuman heat, studied his fallen brothers with the patience of a master craftsman examining flawed materials. "Truth can be shaped like metal in a forge," he observed. "The same knowledge that leads one man to despair might lead another to hope. What matters is what we choose to build from the understanding we have gained." Far beneath the palace, in chambers that had once hummed with the power of the Astronomicon, Malcador the Sigillite felt his ancient life finally reach its end. The effort of maintaining humanity's psychic beacon, while his master's attention turned to more desperate matters, had burned through reserves of strength accumulated across 7 millennia of existence. Yet even as his weathered form collapsed beside the machinery he had tended with such devotion, Malcador smiled with satisfaction that transcended mere mortal accomplishment. The Astronomicon still functioned, but its nature had fundamentally changed. No longer did it require the constant attention of a psychic god to maintain its light across the galaxy. The Emperor's sacrifice had transformed it into something sustainable by mortal psychers working in concert, a tool of navigation rather than an instrument of divine will. "Well done, old friend," Malcador whispered to machinery that no longer responded to his failing consciousness. "You have given them the means to find their own way among the stars. What they build from that gift will be their choice to make." The Sigillite's death marked the end of an era that had begun when humanity first reached beyond Terra's atmosphere. The last of the Emperor's original companions was gone, leaving his children to face the galaxy's challenges with wisdom they would have to earn rather than guidance they could inherit. Across the galaxy, the transformation continued to unfold. On distant worlds where imperial forces had fought desperate holding actions against impossible odds, commanders looked up at skies that no longer writhed with impossible colors. The aurora effects that had marked chaos incursions faded to leave simple starlight unmarked by supernatural influence. Demons that had walked among mortals found themselves banished to realms where their hunger could no longer touch material reality. Space Marines who had served the ruinous powers for years removed their helms to breathe air that carried no whispers of ancient gods. Some chose to lay down their arms and seek what redemption might be possible for warriors who had committed atrocities in service of causes they no longer believed in. Others, too far lost in patterns of violence and corruption, continued their wars without divine blessing, finding that mortal evil required no supernatural enhancement to cause suffering. The warp itself began to stabilize as the boundary between dimensions reasserted itself according to natural law rather than divine whim. Psychers across the galaxy found their abilities diminished but more reliable, no longer subject to the capricious attention of beings whose hunger transcended mortal understanding. Warp travel became safer, if slower, As navigators learned to chart courses through space that behaved according to comprehensible physics. Yet perhaps the most profound change was felt by humanity itself. For the first time since the Emperor had begun his great crusade, the species faced its future without the guidance of beings who claimed to know what destiny awaited among the stars. The dream of unity beneath a single banner had died with its architect, but the capacity to dream new dreams remained intact. In the throne room of the imperial palace, the surviving Primarchs stood over the bodies of their father and fallen brother, contemplating choices that would determine the fate of 10,000 worlds. They were no longer the demigods who had conquered the galaxy in their father's name. They were men who had learned the price of freedom and the weight of responsibility it carried. "What do we do now?" Sanguinius asked, his voice carrying harmonics of uncertainty that would have been impossible when prescient visions showed him fragments of predetermined fate. The question hung in the air between them, like a blade balanced on its edge. For the first time in human history, the answer would be entirely their own to discover. The galaxy waited, no longer guided by the will of gods, but shaped by the choices of mortals who had learned that freedom was both the greatest gift and the most terrible burden that existence could offer. 10 years after the battle for Terra's soul, the galaxy had learned to dream new dreams. The imperium that emerged from the ashes of civil war bore little resemblance to the divine dominion that had once stretched across 10,000 worlds beneath the banner of a god-emperor. In its place stood something unprecedented in human history, a confederation of mortal worlds united not by the fear of divine judgment, but by shared ideals that honored both individual freedom and collective responsibility. The transformation had not come easily. The first years after the Emperor's sacrifice had been marked by chaos, as worlds struggled to understand what it meant to govern themselves without the guiding hand of an immortal god. Some systems had declared independence, seeking to carve out petty kingdoms from the imperium's fragmented territories. Others had fallen into anarchy as local leaders proved incapable of filling the void left by divine authority. Yet slowly, guided by the surviving Primarchs who had chosen cooperation over conquest, a new order had taken shape. On Terra, the imperial palace had been transformed from a monument to divine power into something more profound. A center of learning, where the accumulated wisdom of human civilization was preserved and shared freely among any who sought knowledge. The throne room, where gods had once made decisions that affected the fate of species, now housed a council chamber, where mortal representatives debated policies with voices that carried no supernatural authority, only the weight of reason and experience. Sanguinius stood at the chamber's great windows, watching the sun set over a Terra that bore scars from the final battle, but had healed in ways that transcended mere physical reconstruction. The former Blood Angel's Primarch showed his age now, silver threading through hair that had once been perfect gold, lines marking features that had once seemed carved from marble. Yet his eyes held a peace that had been absent during his centuries as a demigod, burdened by prescient visions of inevitable tragedy. "The Eldar ambassadors arrive tomorrow," reported Jagatai Khan, his voice carrying harmonics of weary satisfaction as he entered the chamber. The former White Scars Primarch moved with the measured pace of a mortal who had learned to husband his strength rather than spending it with the reckless confidence of supernatural resilience. Eldrad's successors believe the webway repairs will be complete within another decade. The cooperation between humanity and the surviving Eldar had been one of the most unexpected consequences of the Emperor's sacrifice. The Farseer's final warning had not only saved the galaxy from chaos domination, but had forged bonds between species that had once viewed each other with suspicion and distrust. Working together to repair the ancient network of tunnels through space-time had taught both races that survival in a hostile universe required alliance rather than isolation. "Good," Sanguinius replied, his voice carrying the measured authority of a leader who governed through consent rather than divine mandate. "The sooner we can restore safe passage through the webway, the sooner we can begin healing the wounds that 7 years of civil war inflicted on the galaxy's furthest reaches." Across Terra, similar scenes of cooperation and reconstruction played out with quiet determination. In the rebuilt workshops of the Mechanicus, tech priests worked alongside mortal engineers to develop technologies that served human needs rather than the arcane requirements of religious doctrine. Former Space Marines, their enhanced abilities still formidable even without supernatural blessing, had become teachers and protectors rather than conquerors, sharing the skills of warfare and leadership with planetary defense forces that would never again depend entirely on transhuman warriors for protection. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation had occurred among the former traitor Primarchs, who had survived the final battle and chosen redemption over continued rebellion. Perturabo stood atop the rebuilt walls of the imperial palace, his scarred features marked by satisfaction of a kind he had never experienced during his centuries as a destroyer of civilizations. The former Iron Warrior's Primarch had become the galaxy's greatest architect, his genius for construction finally unleashed without the bitter resentment that had once driven him to tear down everything others built. "The new orbital stations will be completed ahead of schedule," he reported to Rogel Dawn, his former enemy who had become his closest collaborator in the great work of reconstruction. "The refugee populations from the Cadian Gate will have permanent homes within 2 years rather than 5. Dawn nodded with the measured approval of a master craftsman evaluating quality work. The two Primarchs had learned to see their rivalry not as a source of bitterness, but as healthy competition that drove them both to achieve greater things. Where once they had fought over whose methods were superior, now they combined their expertise to create marvels that neither could have achieved alone. "Your designs have improved," Dawn observed, with something that might have been a smile. "The integration of defensive capabilities with civilian infrastructure shows wisdom that goes beyond mere technical skill." Perturabo accepted the compliment with grace that would have been impossible when supernatural pride had amplified every perceived slight into cosmic insult. "I have learned that building something that will endure requires understanding what it will endure for. Fortifications without purpose are merely monuments to the fear of their creators." Not all of the former traitors had found such clear paths to redemption. Mortarion had withdrawn to the agricultural worlds of the galactic rim, working to heal planets poisoned by his own plague gifts during the dark years of his corruption. The work proceeded slowly, hampered by his own revulsion at what he had once embraced. But steady progress was made. Life returned to worlds that had been sterile for decades, and in that return, something resembling peace had settled over the former Death Guard Primarch's tormented soul. Lorgar remained the most problematic of the surviving traitors, his zealotry undiminished by the absence of divine patrons. Yet even his fanaticism had found constructive outlet in the establishment of philosophical schools that taught comparative religion and ethics. If he could not convert the galaxy to worship of chaos, at least he could challenge its inhabitants to think seriously about questions of meaning and purpose that transcended mere survival. The greatest success story among the redeemed traitors was also the most tragic. Magnus the Red had survived his wounds from the final battle, but his psychic abilities had been permanently diminished by the severing of his warp connection. Where once he had commanded forces that could reshape reality with thought alone, now he possessed only the enhanced intellect and learning capacity that had marked him as exceptional, even before his father's genetic modifications. Rather than mourn what he had lost, Magnus had embraced his reduced circumstances with enthusiasm that surprised even his loyal brothers. He had become the galaxy's greatest teacher, establishing universities on 100 worlds where knowledge was shared freely among any who sought understanding. His lectures on history, philosophy, and the dangers of seeking easy answers to complex questions drew audiences that numbered in the millions. We are pirates and raiders, no longer enhanced by chaos, but still driven by greed and malice, plagued trade routes that were no longer protected by invincible space marine fleets. Alien species that had once feared human expansion began testing the boundaries of territories that were no longer defended by demigods who could shatter planets with their will alone. Yet these challenges, while serious, were comprehensible in ways that cosmic struggles against ancient gods had never been. They could be addressed through diplomacy, trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and the careful application of force by mortal soldiers who understood the value of human life because they shared its fragility. Standing in the chamber where his father had once made decisions that affected the fate of entire species, Sanguinius reflected on the question that had haunted him since the Emperor's sacrifice. Had the choice to abandon godhood in favor of mortal wisdom been the right one? The answer, he had come to believe, lay not in any cosmic judgment, but in the simple fact that it had been chosen freely. For the first time in human history, the species faced its future without the guidance of beings who claimed to know what destiny awaited among the stars. The dream of unity beneath a single banner had died with its architect, but the capacity to dream new dreams remained intact. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the freedom to make mistakes, to learn from them, and to choose again was worth any price. Even the price of abandoning the protection that gods could provide in exchange for the terrible responsibility of determining one's own fate. The sun completed its passage below Terra's horizon, painting the sky with colors that followed natural laws rather than supernatural influence. In the growing darkness, stars emerged with light that would guide human ships through space according to physics that could be understood rather than divine whim that had to be accepted on faith. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were worlds to heal, technologies to develop, alliances to forge, and questions to answer about humanity's role in a galaxy that no longer feared its expansion. The work would be hard, sometimes dangerous, always uncertain. But it would be their work, chosen freely by mortals who had learned the weight of choice and found themselves capable of bearing it. The Emperor's sacrifice had given them something more precious than divine protection. It had given them the freedom to become whatever they proved capable of becoming. And in that freedom, earned through suffering and purchased with the blood of gods, lay the seed of greatness that no cosmic power could grant or take away. The galaxy waited, no longer guided by the will of ancient beings, but shaped by the choices of mortals who had learned that the greatest victory wasn't conquest, but the courage to forge something better from the ruins of broken dreams. Humanity's future remained unwritten, and for the first time since the species had first looked up at stars with longing in their hearts, that future was entirely their own to discover.